It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans, and I will be your host this morning. Boy, things have really heated up out there in Nevada. We're going to tackle that this morning because it is a situation that has escalated and apparently has grown hot. So we will talk about the Bundy Ranch standoff in Nevada today. We'll cover that in our first and second segment. I've got some interesting news for you related to the reasons behind all of this and some of the what I would classify as thinly veiled arguments that the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service have put forth as their reasoning and excuse for the tragedy of what's happening out there today. Apparently, there are some reports, in fact, that the cattle are either being immediately taken to auction or have actually been killed and are being buried on the property. Not quite sure which. There was an incident with some bulldozers and backhoes this morning, or yesterday, I should say, in which apparently the protesters had witnessed them doing something with these backhoes that indicated that they were burying the cattle versus taking them to auction. And it's interesting because the NPS, or I should say BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, put out a statement the other day stating that they would not be taking the animals to auction. But nobody knows where they are or what's happening to them. So be interesting to see how that plays out. So in addition to that, on our third segment this morning, we're going to talk about a DHS report that's been kept secret from the public about how the North Koreans not only have the capability and the wherewithal, but the means, the method, and obviously the motive to conduct an EMP attack on the United States of America. But the Department of Homeland Security has known about this for years, and they've kept it under wraps. And, of course, the concerns are, why would they suppress a report like this for so long? Why would they keep a report like this from public knowledge and or release to not only the American public, but to Congress so that they could take steps that would combat this type of activity? If you're not familiar with the concept of an EMP attack and what that would entail, you'll learn more about it in that segment. That will be our third segment this morning. We're going to, on our fourth segment, we're also going to take a look at this problem that's going on with the IRS committee. This is the committee run by Darrell Issa, and he is the one that's been conducting the hearings on Lois Lerner and the IRS scandal in reference to the Tea Party issue. Now, it's taken an unusual turn. Many of you who followed this may be aware of Congressman Cummings. He is the well, I don't think he's quite I guess he's the assistant chairman or whatever. But he, it turns out that he's actually been colluding with the IRS on this issue. And to make matters worse, he was involved in the targeting of at least one of the groups. Now, he's the Democrat out of Maryland, and he is the one who's been, for all intents and purposes, giving strong cover to the IRS during all of these hearings. And he's the one who's been arguing on their behalf and, essentially arguing that the IRS has done nothing wrong here. But it turns out that not only is he aware that they did something wrong, but he was participatory in it. Wow. I mean, he actually sent a letter to the IRS and got information, privileged information, that's not allowed to be released to the public or even anyone in Congress, and he participated. So now it turns out that we have a member sitting on the committee hearing the IRS issue. I mean, Ladies and gentlemen, what is going on? I mean, it's incredible. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of other things while we're at it in light of these things. Because, I post a lot of stuff up there on our Facebook page and on our website at americasvoicenow.org every morning. And I don't necessarily have an opportunity to go through each and every individual story. So, but I'll try to cover some of them this morning, including one which I want you to be aware of. George Will, a political commentator and an author of some note, and quite honestly, a very credible voice in the community, has put out an op-ed on the Article 5 Constitution of States issue, or Convention of States issue, about amending or modifying the Constitution. I think it's worthy of a read by you. He published it in the Washington Post, and I think it's worthy of a read. If you're not familiar with the Convention of States or the Article 5 amendment process, you've heard about it, but you really don't know what it's all about, I would strongly encourage you to visit that website and take a look at the article. You can find it on americasvoicenow.org under the latest news links. That's all down the middle. You can also find it on our Facebook page. It's pretty close to the top. And basically, I think it's worth a look-see for you to take a good gander and read that article. It'll help you to get familiarized with the issue, while at the same point in time bringing you up to speed on where it stands right now in terms of how many states have approved it and so forth and so on. In addition to that, there are a number of other issues up there, including one that Eric Holder has been using the Justice Department airplane for his own personal trips. I mean, I talked about Holder yesterday. This guy is just... There's nobody more corrupt than Eric Holder in our government right now. I mean, outside of the executive office itself, I don't know that there's anyone who is more deserving of the label of dishonorably discharged than Eric Holder. This guy, actually, there was an investigation into hundreds of personal trips. And he came back and said, and he was aghast at that and insisted that couldn't possibly be true. And his best argument was, it wasn't hundreds, it was only 27. You got to be kidding me. This is the kind of admission that you get from an elitist, from a statist. He resolutely disagrees with the findings of 100 or so trips and says, it wasn't 100 or so, it was only 27. Personal abuses of my power. I mean, it's incredible to me. This is an admission that is sufficient for a call from Congress and from the general public and from every administrative agency available for him to resign immediately, forthwith. Secondly, failing that, Congress should demand his resignation, or, failing his willingness to resign and Congress's unwillingness to force him to resign, place him under what's called inherent contempt. Now, that's a term that you'll be hearing more of in the next coming days. Because what inherent contempt is once you've been convicted and found guilty of contempt of Congress, which he has, both civilly and criminally, Congress has the power to incarcerate you and hold you until the next Congress is seated in 2015. And I think cooling off period for Eric Holder would be a good thing. So I encourage you to read that article because I think it would be a worthwhile understanding for you to grasp exactly the depth of depravity, not only of this particular man, but the entire Department of Justice. You know, the Congress right now is forcing, we'll get into this when we talk about Lerner in our fourth segment, but in the IRS. But Congress is going to be voting today as to whether or not to issue a charge, first a contempt of Congress charge, against Lois Lerner for failing to testify, and secondarily, a request for the Department of Justice to prosecute her. The problem, of course, is that Eric Holder is going to be the one who's going to have to do the prosecution. So no one believes that there won't be a conflict of interest here. The issue is that, you know, at this stage in the game, folks, the Department of Justice is responsible for the prosecution of all of these crimes that we hear about within Congress, within the Justice Department, within all of these administrative and federal agencies, within the executive offices itself, and within the judicial system, if in the event that you had it as an example, a judge that did something inappropriate. How can we expect justice when the Department of Justice itself is one of the most corrupt agencies we have? think about that for a moment. The Department of Justice is literally on par with the most corrupt organizations that we have in the nation. And they're in a position of strength in a way that departments and agencies like the EPA and the IRS are not. You know, the IRS can do an enormous amount of damage to you as an individual. But the Department of Justice holds a singularly unique position in that they have the power of prosecution and persecution, quite frankly, under them. And that is a dangerous place for corruption to have seated itself. All right, let's break into our first topic because I want to get onto this Bundy Ranch standoff. Number one, it went hot yesterday. So there was a couple of things that you need to know about. One, they threw a woman to the ground because she was standing in front of a truck. Now, this truck was apparently trying to leave. It was a dump truck or a pickup truck towing a trailer with a backhoe on it. And apparently, there are reports that these backhoes have been burying cows that they may have shot or killed in some way, shape, or form, rather than remove them from the property. And the BLM came out yesterday in a public statement and said that they would not be taking the cattle to auction anytime soon, or in the immediate future, I think is the words they used. But of course, now there's some concerns about whether or not they're actually terminating those cattle. And there's apparently some reports that these backhoes were used to dig big holes because cows are big. And they've collected, I think, 140 of them or something right now out of about 900. So essentially, this woman tried to block this truck from leaving, and the police came over and threw this woman to the ground. She's a cancer patient. And then they sicked a dog on a pregnant woman, and then they tased this one guy's cousin 3 separate times. It was there's videos up on our Facebook page. There's videos up on America's Voice Now and on YouTube as well. But here's the point: the situation at this point has taken what I would consider to be a drastic turn for the worse, in the sense that we now have federal law enforcement officials who are committing violence on protesters. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what more you're waiting for than to see this kind of activity. Furthermore, they have, for all intents and purposes, declared a limited martial law. They've declared a limited martial law because essentially what they've said is that if you step off the road at any point onto this BLM-controlled property or regulated property, that you would be in violation of their rules and regulations, and you'll be taken and charged and placed into federal prison in federal custody. Now, they've also created a number of free speech zones, constitutional free speech zones. I know that's laughable, but and to be candid with you, even the governor of Nevada, and in addition to that, the other senator of Nevada, this is the guy that you never hear about, right? This is the Republican U.S. senator from Nevada. His name is Dean Heller. Not Harry Reid. Harry Reid is not Dirty Harry here. Dirty Harry's been silent about this whole thing. But this other guy has come forth, and he's stated very, very emphatically that the federal government is overreaching, and that they are resulting from this roundup. He believes that constitutional rights of the individuals associated in protesting here are being trampled. Not to mention the constitutional rights of the individual whose cattle they're stealing. Now, as you may or may not know, the other day, the rancher's son was out on the property, and he refused to stay inside of one of the free speech zones. Guy's looked to be about 35 years old, big husky guy. He was attempting to videotape with his cell phone the roundup that they were doing of his father's cattle, and he was holding the cell phone up, and he was standing on the street. And now, don't forget, this is in the middle of Nevada, so it's desert, right? And it's just a ribbon of highway. He was standing on the side of the road, or on the actual road itself, and he was tackled by about 15 or 17 agents. They beat him up. They stood on his head He has big red marks all down the side of his face. They dragged him off to jail, and that's when the father came out and publicly said, that's it. This is going to be a range war. They've taken my cattle. Now they've taken my son. This means range war. That's what kicked this off. The governor of Nevada has been suspiciously silent about this. And to make matters worse, the sheriff of the county, it's Clark County in Nevada, the sheriff of the county has been conspicuously silent, saying, hands off, I'm washing my hands of the whole deal. He is anything but a constitutional sheriff. In fact, Sheriff Richard Mack, the leader of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, has publicly come out and derided him for not taking a stand in defense of the citizens in his community. Because remember, ladies and gentlemen, the sheriff of any county is the highest law enforcement officer in the nation. Their authority exceeds any federal agency. It exceeds any state agency. It exceeds that of the governor itself. Himself, herself, whatever. In other words, for all intents and purposes, this particular sheriff could have diffused this situation very simply. He could have gone to the BLM and said, as the sheriff, I'm ordering you to leave the property. That's it. He could have diffused the situation a week ago, a month ago, 8 months ago, 2 years ago. He's refused. He is absolutely, steadfastly refused to get involved. And it's shameful because that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we fight so strongly to make sure that we have a sheriff within our regional county areas that is a constitutional sheriff who will stand up and stand as a buffer, interpose himself or herself between the citizens in a community and either the federal or even the state government when they attempt to abuse their authority, when they overreach, and that's the word straight out of the mouth of the Nevada governor and the U.S. senator there. Now, the governor has called this intimidation, and he's used some pretty strong language. It's amazing to me that this has not been picked up by more mainstream media. CBS in Las Vegas has picked it up because it's right outside of Las Vegas. But you don't hear a lot about this on the mainstream media. You didn't hear at all about it last night on Fox News. Nobody discussed it until it got to Hannity. I looked. There was nobody talking about it on any of the other, Communist News Network or MSLSD or any of them. So the upshot here is that what we have is a situation where at this stage in the game, the woman who was thrown to the ground, she's a cancer patient. She had throat cancer. And they threw her to the ground. You can see in the video that her knees on her pants are all ripped open. She's got cuts on her hands from being thrown to the ground. She's 57 years old and the mother of 11 children. I mean, really incredible, ladies and gentlemen, that this is where we have descended to. Now, Bundy has been protesting this for many, many years, since the late 90s, early 90s, actually. The Bureau of Land Management has, for all intents and purposes, taken this land, declared themselves to be the final arbiter of what can be done on that property. But here's the most interesting aspect of this. Their claim, and the reason that they're ejecting this man and these cattle off of this ranch, which his family has been using since the 1870s. Ladies and gentlemen, that's immediately after the Civil War. The reason that they're utilizing or throwing this issue out there is because of the desert tortoise. Now, the desert tortoise is and we're going to have to continue this in our next segment. We've only got about 4 minutes left. But the desert tortoise is listed as an endangered animal. There are some 100,000 in the wild, and they have a desert tortoise conservation center right in it's a refuge right in the Vegas area. Now, it's very interesting because their claim here is that the cattle are eating the same fodder that the tortoise eats. And so the tortoises are being threatened further because of the cattle's proximity, or the fact that they're both contending for the same food source. What's very interesting is that there was an article in the on Raw Story back in August of 2013, the 25th of August. And here's what it says. The government is going to euthanize hundreds of these desert tortoises because their budget has been cut. So hold on a minute now. Let's get this straight. First, you're telling me that you're going to eject this man, destroy his ranch, imprison his child, throw protesters to the ground, hold families at gunpoint. They've got helicopters, including Black Hawk and Apache helicopters there, folks. I'm not kidding you. There are hundreds and hundreds of law enforcement agents all the way from states like Utah that have converged on this facility, and they are taking this man's cattle to protect a tortoise that they themselves just killed half of the protected collection because they were out of funding. And the funding, by the way, for this refuge is over $1 million a year. They fell short of their funding. They had collected only $300,000 of the necessary funding, $290,000 to be exact. And as a result, since their primary funding source of local developer fees had not met the budget, they were going to euthanize and kill half of the 1,400 tortoises that they had. Now, listen, there's something desperately wrong with this picture when you're claiming that you're, for all intents and purposes, authorizing hundreds of law enforcement officers to take an action against an American citizen who's been using this land, which, by the way, the BLM usurped from Clark County. It all belonged to Clark County, Nevada. The Bureau of Land Management came in and said, we're going to take control of that land at a later date, 1993. But from 1870 to 1993, this guy's family has been using that property to range their cattle. I mean, it's incredible the amount of hubris and arrogance that is exhibited by these administrative agencies. And this tops the cake for you. The center admits that they have to close this 220-acre facility and euthanize half of the 1,400 tortoises that they are now claiming is the reason that they've got to go take this man's cattle. I mean, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I leave it up to you. I mean, really, think about that for a moment. We're going to take a break. When we return, we're going to tackle our second topic, which is going to continue on the continuation of the Bundy Ranch issue here. We're going to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to give you some quotes. I'm sorry, but I do not have the ability to show you the videos. I wish I did. But we're going to talk to you a little bit about what the family has indicated is going on here and the plea that they have made. We're also asking individuals that have the wherewithal and the capability to get out there and join and assist these protesters. Fight back against this. Let's utilize the power of mass civil disobedience. Ladies and gentlemen, we can do this peacefully now, or you can wait a little bit longer, and then it's going to get to bloodshed. Now's the time. We'll return in just a moment. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Back. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host here this morning. We're talking about the Bundy Ranch and the federal standoff going on out there. For those of you that are just joining us, it is a tragedy in the making and a crisis, a constitutional crisis, quite frankly. We've got a Bureau of Land Management and a National Park Service that have taken it upon themselves to attempt to enforce a court order, which, quite frankly, has its own nebulous questionability. You know, the issue here is, and with all due respect, I hear people say, well, there's a court order. I understand that. But I got to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Jefferson made it very clear that the courts are not the final arbiters of you, your constitutional rights, or the Constitution itself. You know, the Nazis had courts. The Soviet Union had courts that sent literally millions of Russians to gulags. The Italian fascists during the time of Mussolini had courts. Venezuela has courts. And yet, if you're going to give credence to the courts, you have to recognize that their power and authority only exists when the courts and the government itself are operating in a manner where justice is sought. With all due respect, that is not the case here today. And it hasn't been the case in the United States of America for a very long time. What we have is administrative agencies where you go before an administrative law judge. You do not have a right to a trial by jury. You have a right to be heard before an administrative law judge who, quite frankly, represents the agency that you're in contention with. Anyone would construe that to be a conflict of interest. Bundy is not the only rancher to have taken on the federal government in this way. I saw an expose or a special the other day about another family that's been in the same fight over the same exact issue, by the way, for literally 30 years. The problem here is that the Bureau of Land Management has given itself authority. It is self-appointed. Recognize that in order for the Bureau of Land Management to give itself authority, merely all it needs to do is create a rule and a regulation and then post it in the Federal Register. That's it. There's no oversight. There's no review. There's generally a public comment period. But these public comment periods are, for all intents and purposes, a sham. Number one, you're generally prohibited from seeing what the public comments were. So it's up to them to interpret the public comments they've received and then make a determination as to whether or not they want to adhere to those public comments. More often than not, the public comment period is also interspersed with an enormous amount of lobbying activity where professional lobbyists who are paid for whatever special interest is being served by this particular rule and regulation go in there and they work with Congress or they work with the representative who is in charge of that given, who's the representative for that given area or zone or whatever the park is or whatever the rulemaking is about. And these lobbyists, they control and rule the day, ladies and gentlemen. This is not something where the general public is ever really given any credence. Their wishes are never given credibility. I can speak to that on a personal level, where we have been putting in public notice to the National Park Service in the Ozark Scenic Riverways. They attempted actually to utilize a tactic where all of the comments had to be submitted electronically so that they could be reviewed and chosen. And the way that, just to give you an example of how corrupted the process is, they actually had the nerve to say that if five public comments from concerned people came in and they were all talking about the same thing, in other words, in the national parks or in the Ozark Scenic Riverways area here, let's say that 5 articles came in and said, we don't think you should restrict canoes, that they would consider that to be one response because all 5 of them dealt with canoes. You cannot be more corrupt than that. Meanwhile, lobbyists are plying them with money, plying them with promises of special favors down the road. The BLM, at this point, has made a couple of statements. First of all, there are about 900 and some odd cattle that belong to Bundy. And the BLM claims that they've been trespassing without required grazing permits for over 25 years. Well, that's not exactly true. BLM rescinded his permits. And first of all, he's been doing this since the 1870s. So the fact that he's even obtaining a permit, see, this goes to the heart of the issue of where you never want to have government issue a license or a permit. Because once they give that to you, they are in control of you and your destiny forevermore. What government gives to you, they can take away from you. That's why this issue with Chuck hits the fan Schumer, when the Schumer hits the fan, with the issues surrounding the licensing of journalists, is completely and totally unacceptable. Our free speech is not limited to who the government licenses, nor is your free speech limited to limiting a protester to a fenced-in area in the desert in Nevada where you are told if you step out of that area and protest, you're subject to federal arrest. Now, the court passed that as a law, too. Are you going to give credibility to that law? Are you going to tell me that the idea that your free speech rights are limited to a small, specific geographic area within a fence because a court said so? Really? They have made it very clear that if you step outside that fence or if you step off the road, and there are signs all along the highway, I mean, as close as every 50 feet in certain areas, where they're notifying you that if you step off the highway, you are subject to federal arrest and imprisonment. It's public land, ladies and gentlemen. They don't own it. We do. Didn't we just go through this with the government shutdown and World War II vets who wanted to go to the Veterans Memorial? Didn't we just go through this where they were shutting down willfully to intentionally hurt individuals and families, where they were shutting down national parks? They didn't have to shut those parks down. They chose to spend extra money to do so. Not because it was the right thing to do, not because they were shorthanded. They hired extra personnel to accomplish the task. What their goal was to intentionally cause injury to the people who wanted to visit those parks. And this is no different. None whatsoever. Senator Dean Heller, he's told the U.S. Bureau of Land Management chief, whose name is Neil Corns in Washington, D.C., that these people in Nevada are law-abiding and that they should not be penalized by an overreaching federal agency. With all due respect, I've got to ask, why in Congress is no one shutting the purse strings on these agencies? We've talked about this repeatedly. There's not a federal agency, not a single one with two exceptions, that has the authority to exist constitutionally. There are only two. What are they? Border Patrol, which is a recognized constitutionally granted power authorized to the federal government, and the Commerce Department. That's it. None of these other federal agencies, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, the ATF, the FCC, the FAA, the USDA, the FTC, you can pick it, there's thousands of them. None of them have constitutional authority to exist. You want to argue the point? Let me give you the argument. We never gave Congress the power, in our limited power of attorney to them, to subdelegate that limited power of authority to other individuals who we did not elect, whose names we don't know, who are unaccountable, who don't even take an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States or to faithfully execute the laws. Get it? Congress has illegally and unconstitutionally given themselves self-appointed power to subdelegate our limited power of attorney to administrative agencies, who then, for all intents and purposes, make rules and regulations that act and parade about as law, but are not. What we now have is proof in the pudding that you've got a federal agency, two in fact, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, that are 100% out of control. They have taken it upon themselves to act as a law enforcement agency. Where's the authority for that? Where is the constitutional authority for that? Where is the constitutional authority for them to limit your constitutional First Amendment right to free speech, to redress your grievances against your government? Where is their authority to take an individual into custody for stepping 1 foot to the left or 1 foot to the right? It does not exist. And you cannot pass a law. Jefferson himself, Madison, repeated the refrain over and over and over. Any law passed which violates the Constitution is null and void on its face. Null and void, and of no effect. That's not a paraphrase. That's a verbatim quote. Null and void, and of no effect. You can have 100 judges who say that the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management have the right to go take this man's cattle. It does not make them legitimate. You can have a court that deems that it's okay to commit murder, but it doesn't make it so. You can have a court that deems it illegal for you to possess or own a certain weapon, but your Second Amendment right does not say you can own any weapon as long as the government approves of it. It doesn't say you can own any weapon you like as long as you have less than 10 rounds in it. This isn't overreach, ladies and gentlemen. This is tyranny. And Dean Heller, Senator Dean Heller, should know that. Senator Harry Reid, Dirty Harry, he already knows that. You know why? Because Dirty Harry is bathed in treason and tyranny. Dirty Harry is the most corrupt senator in the nation, without a doubt. His family has gotten rich based upon his tenure as a U.S. senator. The dirty deals, that's why I call him Dirty Harry. Go look at the history of Dirty Harry. Go look it up. Go look at how his sons are all involved in real estate transactions around the state, and all of them get preferential treatment. Where's Dirty Harry on all of this? Governor Brian Sandoval, he's the Republican governor for Nevada. He pointed earlier to what he called, quote, an atmosphere of intimidation resulting from the roundup. And he says that constitutional rights of the protesters and the family are being trampled. Senator Heller said that he had received a contact from local officials and residents and the Nevada Cattlemen's Association, and his concern was, quote, extremely concerned. By the way, I hate when they say that. I'm deeply concerned. I'm extremely concerned. You know what that means? Get out of my face. I've got nothing further to say. He remains, quote, extremely concerned about the size of this closure and disruptions with access to roads, water, and electrical infrastructure. Really. They're taking this man's property. They've imprisoned his son. They've thrown protesters to the ground, and you're deeply and extremely concerned about the size of the closure. The closure of what? The size of the park? What kind of a fool are you? Disruptions with access to roads, water, and electrical infrastructure. So, are you trying to tell me, sir, that disruptions with access to roads, water, and electrical infrastructure override the rights of that individual? They've shut down, the Bureau of Land Management has shut down an area, literally, folks, that is the size of the state of Delaware. The size of the state of Delaware. Also that they can round up 900 cattle, which, by their own admission, will cost $3 million. Between $2 and $3 million. So you're telling me that between $2 and $3 million of taxpayer money is going to be spent to round up cattle that, 900 cattle, that's a lot of cattle. And to a cattleman, that's a lot of money. But you're talking about nowhere close to the and under what auspice are they going to auction those off and then return money back to the taxpayers? Is that the game plan? Well, we don't know. But we do know that if there were backhoes that were burying cows, then there's not even a resource to sell to retain the taxpayer, to refund the taxpayers' money. They've hired cowboys to come in pickups and horses and helicopters to drive and herd the cattle. They've closed off the park so that there can be no press, no media, no public to see what they're up to. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a government which operates in secret. And a government which operates in secret means that right off the bat, they are operating outside the boundaries. I mean, the Supreme Court, again, never a final arbiter of our Constitution, has declared emphatically that you, as a citizen, have the right to film any law enforcement officer during the occurrence of their on-duty service. Because as a public enforcement officer, they are operating in the auspices of the public. You have every right to film everything they do. And yet, they've closed off an area the size of Delaware to prohibit that exact activity. This is an argument, folks, that goes far beyond a rancher and a couple of hundred cows. This is a farm, or a situation, I should say, that comes into play with a couple of different major issues. One, states' rights. Two, federal ownership of land within states, which, by the way, the Constitution itself specifically prohibits. It says that the federal government may not own anything other than the 10 square miles of Washington, D.C. That's it. They can only own a few limited forts and depots around the country. That's it, folks. That's all they own. They don't own these massive swaths of land that the Bureau of Land Management has usurped and stolen from individual states. They don't have possession of national parks. They can pass a law that says we have the right to make national parks, but it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it legal. It doesn't make them authorized. They're only authorized because we sit here silently and allow it to continue. Now, I've been calling for any individual who hears this program, who has the availability and the wherewithal to get out there, to go out there and assist. I got to tell you, if there were thousands of protesters out there instead of 100 or 150, I'll bet you they would not have thrown this woman to the ground. They would not have stood there with tasers out, tasing protesters. And to be honest with you, somebody would have gotten to the bottom of whether or not they're actually burying cattle or not. And if they are burying cattle, where's PETA? Where's PETA? Where are you? Where's the Humane Society if they are? Even if they're not, where are they to make sure that they're humanely capturing those cattle and that they're not abusing them? If those were puppy dogs, PETA and the well, perhaps not PETA. Yeah, I guess PETA would be too. I always think of them as people eating tasty animals, not. But, you know, PETA and the Humane Society should be on this scene. Where are they? Nowhere to be found. Crickets. And to make matters worse, the governor or the government is basically doing all of this for a group of turtles that they themselves euthanized less than a year ago. Absolutely absurd. The point here is that this is not about 900 cattle. This is about control and power. This is about an agency which deems that they have the authorization, the right to abuse these individual families. They threw this woman to the ground. They sicked a canine dog on a pregnant woman. Come on. They had a bunch of dogs there. You can see in the video. They tased a protester 3 times. You could hear the thing click, 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 click. If you're out of work, if you're retired, if you have the time, if you're on vacation, get out there. Lock elbows with hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of other Americans. And let's put out a message that we are going to ring that guy's ranch and that none of you are welcome. In fact, if we have enough individuals, what we really need to do is turn the tables and arrest all 200 of them. That's the estimated number of law enforcement. By now, by the way, that number has probably shot up to twice that. Because they see that this is a conflict happening. With all due respect, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot allow this to become the next Waco, the next Ruby Ridge. If it does, if one innocent protester, if one member of that family is further hurt, then this should be the opening shot, fired across the bow. This should be the shot heard around the world. And with it, the United States of America should be returned to control of the people. This should be the catalyst. We're going to take a break. When we return, we're going to tackle our last two topics. We'll keep an eye on this, and we'll be reporting to you as we move forward. Our next subject will be the DHS and how they've kept a report of North Korea's EMP threat secret from us. Suppressed that report for years. And by the way, no one in Congress has taken any mitigating action to protect us from it. And they know it's available, and they know it's live. Our fourth topic will be Cummings and the IRS committee and how Cummings has colluded with the IRS and Lois Lerner. And he sits on the committee that's hearing the abuse. Unbelievable. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Please make sure that you work with our sponsors. I'm going to give you names of a few of them here. You can visit our friends over at the law offices of Jason Henry. If you have any legal challenge going on in your life right now, whether it be a civil matter, a criminal matter, whether it's a lawsuit or you are suing or being sued, if you have any kind of a federal criminal charge or a state criminal charge, Jason Henry is an excellent attorney who's got an enormous amount of experience in that area. If you've got a family member that you're trying to get out or get an appeal handled, excellent work for appeals. I've seen a lot of his appeal work, and he's very, very good at it. You can give him a call at 417-256-4100, 417-256-4100. He also handles issues like divorce and custody cases and such like that. So make sure that you give him a call. Doesn't matter whether it's a DUI or a federal gun charge or whatever the case may be. He is competent and capable of handling that and has a lot of experience in those areas. So please make sure that you give him a shot at handling your case. I'm sure that you'll be confident after having spoken with him and outlined your case. He'll be able to give you some idea of the cost associated with it and what he can do to help you. Again, it's law offices of Jason Henry, 417-256-4100. Visit our friends while you're on the square at the Patriot Cigar and Tobacco Shop, outstanding facility where they've got all kinds of tobacco products, cigars and pipes, and every accessory and accoutrement you could ask for. You can reach them at 417-257-1776. You can give them a call. They do ship around the country, but also ship in our local terrestrial radio broadcast area. While you're there, swing into Wits End Classic Barbershop and get yourself a great haircut for $10, folks. $10. He also does that hot lather straight razor shave and with the hot towel and the whole 9 yards. A great opportunity for you to enjoy that. Take your boyfriend or your husband or your son down for a special treat and get him a hot lather shave. You won't be disappointed. Make sure that you see our friends over at Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner Boulevard. Only the Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner Boulevard. And they have a big Easter basket drawing that they've got there, a boys' and a girls' Easter basket. These things are huge. They're like 4 feet tall. You fill out and donate $1 to the American Cancer Society, and they throw your name in the hat to win both baskets. The drawing will happen on the 19th, and you do not need to be present. Make sure that you swing in there. Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner Boulevard. Today is reduced lunch day, $5. Make sure you swing in there today. And last but not least, our friends at Battery Station. Visit them online at batterystation.com, and you can call them at 417-257-7799. We'll be right back.
It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice, right here, right now. You're joining us midway through our show. We're glad to have you on board. Today is Thursday, the 10th of April. We will be discussing in this particular segment the DHS and the report which they have kept silent from Americans relating to North Korea and the threat of an EMP attack that they have very clearly made. We'll get into how dangerous the risk really is to our nation of an EMP attack coming from a nation like North Korea. It's not just North Korea, but the particular study was suppressed because it was a report that was prepared by the Department of Homeland Security for the Defense Department. And in that report, they concluded that North Korea could deliver on its threat, that it had the capability and the wherewithal to accomplish that, and that by the use of an electromagnetic pulse attack, they may well be able to destroy the entire United States or vast segments. And there are a couple of examples that they used in the report. Now, WorldNet Daily is the one who put this out there, and WND.com. And the links to the article will be in the body of this, in the subject area for this video, if you're catching this on YouTube. Or it's on our website and our Facebook page and on Patriot FB and a host of other places that we post stuff up. The problem that we have here is that, for those of you that aren't aware, we have no solution to an EMP attack. Even the CIA chief has made that statement very clearly. We have looked at the possibility of an EMP attack in the United States of America from a number of threats, not the least of which is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and a host of other smaller but perhaps less capable incidents. Here's the point. What you don't know about EMP, and you need to know, is that it is not the type of nuclear weapon when you think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki type weapon. Detonation occurs at about 20 or 30 miles above the atmosphere, or above the surface, I should say. And all it creates, there's no fallout. And the damage, of course, it's done at such a high altitude that there's no physical damage to property. But what it does do is it creates it electrifies the atmosphere over the area in which it bursts, and it creates an electromagnetic pulse that for a brief nanosecond fries all the electronics. Now, this is the same thing that you've heard about from the Carrington event, which happened in the 1800s, where it was caused by a massive solar explosion that hit the Earth with heavy rays, gamma rays, and effectively it was so powerful that it melted copper telegraph lines. Now, we didn't have the electronic world in the late 1800s that we have today, and so the only way that anyone actually ever knew that the Carrington attack or Carrington event occurred was the fact that these telegraph lines were so heavily affected. Telegraph operators were shocked. Literally physically shocked. It was so severe that even with the batteries disconnected, telegraph operators were able to send messages because the lines were humming with power. It melted copper lines. Now, scientifically, the suspicion is that there's been many of these Carrington-type events in past history, but no one can really prove it or disprove it because there's no electronics around to verify that they were fried. However, our world is totally different today. And with the advent and the dependence that we have on electronics, whether that be information systems or our grid itself, and the ability to operate and run that grid, whether it be automobiles or transportation, whether it be manufacturing or the ability to produce power or produce actual fuel. Remember now, when you talk about an EMP, the issue of an EMP would be catastrophic in the United States. I mean, think about this for a moment. Let's say that you were going to throw an EMP in two different countries. One would be the United States of America, and another would be, let's say, Afghanistan. Think about the difference. Well, Afghanistan, in large part, is already a nation. I mean, perhaps over the last 20 years or so, they've gained a lot of electronic capability, but only exclusively as a result of the United States and Russia's involvement over there as in war. But these are, for all intents and purposes, it's a third world country. They would not be as impacted by an EMP event, whether natural or man-made, as would the United States of America. For us, it would be catastrophic, devastating. It would completely wipe out industry. It would wipe out hospitals, any transportation, any power. It would destroy the items that actually operate and run on electricity and permanently destroy them. They would not be salvageable because it would burn the boards, the circuit boards. It would fry them. It would burn out the generators and the transmitters and the parts and portions of our grid that are, for all intents and purposes, irreplaceable for years. In other words, the transformers that support our electrical grid system in the United States of America, in some cases would take, and these are estimates that Congress has come up with in some hearings that they've had, but they would take 3 years or more to reproduce. And worse yet, we no longer manufacture them in the United States. They're now manufactured overseas. So, first and foremost, you'd have to replace them. Assuming, for argument's sake, that this was not a natural event, and therefore maybe global in its scale, you could, let's say, have a new transmitter or a new power system built in another country, France or, let's say, Germany. But then you got to transport it from there to the United States. Then you got to get it from the coast, with no power, mind you, all the way to, let's say, Ohio or Nevada. Whole different circumstance now, huh? The problem is that we have no methodology to, one, protect ourselves from this, and or to diffuse one were it to come. Worse than that, the DHS created this report and then has suppressed it from public knowledge. There was a copy that was obtained by Peter Pry from sources within the DHS. And the report states that North Korea could use the Yunha-3 space launch vehicle and deliver a nuclear warhead as a satellite over the South Pole to attack the U.S. from the south. Now, Pry is the executive director of the Congressional Advisory Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and he pointed out that the U.S. has, quote, no early warning radar or interceptors to stop such a missile from the south. He's also the director of the congressionally mandated EMP Commission, which has been looking at this issue of EMP for some time. Of course, their hands are tied, and here's why. And, of course, the ridiculousness of this entire thing will be borne out to you in just a moment. The reason that we will not put together a plan of to essentially bleed off or put circuit breakers, if you will, into our grid system is that the utility companies have long lobbied Congress not to pass that type of legislation that would mandate that they institute a stopgap measure, a circuit breaker, if you will, in the grid that would be able to protect individual aspects or portions. Now, EMP, for all intents and purposes, you know, it would still destroy automobiles' electronic ignition systems, and it would still destroy airplanes that were in the air and airplanes on the ground. But at least the grid would be intact, so we would be able to replace the items, the widget, the iPad, the car, the whatever. But you would never be able to replace the actual grid itself. And the pressure has been on from lobbyists who have spent tens of millions of dollars to keep from having to spend a few billion, which, quite frankly, they're going to pass on to you anyway. And frankly, I would just as soon see the federal government put that money up and make sure that it was done and done properly, and then, as opposed to, some of the most asinine and ridiculous things we do spend money on. Pry is the staff director for the congressionally mandated EMP Commission. And they have concluded that the damage from either a natural or a man-made EMP event on the nation's unprotected electrical grid would have a cascading effect that would impact life-sustaining critical infrastructure, as well as electronic components and all automated control systems. So let's understand what life-sustaining critical infrastructure is. That's the hospital that's got the guy alive on dialysis, or a heart monitor, or a breathing apparatus. Life-sustaining critical infrastructure would be the ambulances that could not run anymore to get to people that were now, injured in a fire because there's no fire trucks to get out to put out the fire. It would also affect the electronic components and automated control systems. And there we're talking about water. There we're talking about the natural gas lines that are in the ground. I mean, there is electronic automated control that determines how much gas is in the pipe. What's the pressure? When those go, does the pipe just back up? Does it dry up? Does it explode because the pressure becomes too high? Along with the critical infrastructure of the electronic grid system, we have to also include telecommunications. Everything that we do in terms of communications is based on electronics. Everything. All the routing, all the tables that determine how a phone call gets routed, whether it's from your NSA personal tracking device, or whether it's, your home telephone, or whether it's a walkie-talkie, all of that involves critical electronic components. Banking. The United States and the dollar would evaporate like that. Literally. Finance, petroleum, and natural gas pipelines, and the ability to refine and create more. Transportation, food and water delivery, emergency services, and even space systems. Don't forget, you'd have satellites dropping out of the sky like bowling pins. DHS conducted this study after the spring of 2013, where the nuclear crisis with North Korea was brought forth, and the communist government's leadership threatened a, quote, preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. And if you recall, I talked about this back in spring of 2013 when I talked about the fact that North Korea had put out on television and sent out on videos these videos where they were depicting North Korea launching a preemptive nuclear strike on U.S. cities, in Washington, D.C. and New York, as I recall, were the two. Now, DHS began taking a look at this and saying, well, maybe these guys are more serious. And it turns out, not only are they serious, but they have the method and the means, and obviously the motive, to accomplish that. They actually practiced an EMP attack scenario, North Korea did, 3 months before that crisis occurred. Now, that crisis was, if you recall, they were detonating nuclear weapons at the time underground and doing testing and so forth and so on. During that crisis, according to Mr. Pry, North Korea issued a general mobilization order to its nuclear forces, and that included their, what they call, space forces. According to Mr. Pry, they're just testing the water to see what they can get away with. And, quote, it shows that Pyongyang is planning something big against the U.S. Now, he didn't say this might indicate, this may be some sort of an indicator or a test. What he said is, quote, the North Koreans are seeing what they can get away with. it shows that Pyongyang is planning something big against the U.S. He didn't say they may be planning. He didn't say it's a possibility. He said it shows that Pyongyang is planning something big against the U.S. In this suppressed study, the DHS indicated that if North Korea were to attempt to deploy their space launch vehicle, or there's another one they have called the Taepodong 2 Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, it's an ICBM, the Defense Department could destroy the missile on its launch pad before it actually launched. The problem with that is this. One, they're not limited to being launched from North Korea. In fact, there were some that were pulled from Cuba not so long ago that were capable of going up and being sent up 150 miles above the Earth, which would be the height that you would do a high-altitude EMP. Furthermore, they could actually just be launched from a cargo ship out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, for example, or maybe off the eastern coast, or maybe 100 miles out off the west coast. At the time, Obama and the White House, quote, repeatedly asserted that North Korea did not yet have the capacity to attack the United States or U.S. allies with nuclear missiles. But he conveniently, like everything else this piece of trash does, he conveniently left off the fact that they could utilize an EMP, which quite frankly would be far more devastating to the United States of America than a separate nuclear detonation in a major city. Oh, it wouldn't be worse for the 5 million residents of that city, but it would affect 315 million Americans when all of us no longer had power for the remainder of our natural lives. The death rate in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, would be 2/3 of the population within the first 24 months. Be 1/3 of the population within the first 2 months. Why was this kept a secret? Why? Well, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but think about it for a moment. There's been a couple of books written about the idea of it, that it could be utilized as cover under the auspices of a global economic collapse, a fiscal collapse of the dollar, which would start a slide globally, and then back that up with an EMP, which would basically, for all intents and purposes, throw everybody into the dark for so long nobody would ever be able to figure out what was really going on. The problem here is that we are woefully unprepared. And for all of the trillions of dollars that we're spending on national security, the estimates to make our grid EMP, not proofed, but EMP defensible, whether natural or man-made, is in the billions of dollars. We're talking 2 to 5 billion is the number that I've heard. And I've seen it repeatedly, by the way. So it's not one that, I just picked a low number. 2 to 5 billion. With all due respect, ladies and gentlemen, $2 to $5 billion is the rounding error on the Senate's travel bill for a year. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. The Department of State, it came out the other day, and Hillary Clinton cannot account for $6 billion worth of contracts. And that was only during her tenure. You're telling me that you cannot come up with $2 to $5 billion to make it a priority to protect our national grid. I'm not saying that your Chevy Cobalt is ever going to run again in the event of a natural or a man-made EMP. It probably won't. But I can tell you this. The loss of electrical power in the United States of America would have a devastating effect on every aspect of life throughout the nation. In December of 2012, North Korea launched a satellite. This makes it even uglier. This was information provided to WorldNet Daily by Pry and former ambassador U.S. Ambassador Henry Cooper, and they indicated to the author of this article that the satellite had been launched, and it was large enough to have been a nuclear weapon capable of orbiting the Earth and detonating on command over the United States or anywhere else that they so chose. In the interview with WorldNet Daily, Pry said Pyongyang in April of 2013, a year ago, folks, launched a satellite that was tracking orbit over the United States. First in the middle of the country, so it ran right over the top of the middle of the country, which is the perfect place to cover basically the entire country. And then the second time over the eastern half of the United States, where it ran right up the eastern seaboard. That's the most populated corridor in the United States. In fact, the estimates are that an EMP in that area would wipe out 70% or cover 70% of the population centers in the United States. Pry said very clearly that if the satellite were a nuclear weapon, exploded above the middle of the U.S., the EMP effect on the vulnerable grid system would have been nationwide. In the numerous underground nuclear tests, North Korea has been testing low-kiloton nuclear weapons that Pry says were a super EMP. Quote, super EMP, that is a device that's designed to emit a large amount of gamma rays, which is the electromagnetic energy that's associated with an EMP blast. Again, there's no fallout from radiation here. This thing gets blown up at 150, 200 miles above the surface of the Earth. In this interview with WorldNet Daily, Pry said that the revelations in the suppressed DHS report are only the latest indications of North Korean intentions aimed at a possible nuclear EMP attack on the United States. The prospect is the latest in a series of recent North Korean actions. He's talked also about the revelation of a Soviet-era nuclear-capable ground-to-air missile that was discovered on a North Korean ship just in July of 2013 as it ran through the Panama Canal. That was 90 miles from the United States of America. And with a missile that was launched from a freighter, it would be virtually impossible to ever identify who was responsible. Pry says the EMP attack on the U.S. would not have to originate from North Korea, but could be a missile such as the SA-2 launched from any freighter off the U.S. or the East or the Gulf Coast. And there would be no missile defense capable of halting such an event. Ladies and gentlemen, I just give you the information. Do with it as you will. But this is another example of a crime against humanity, that the DHS would have this information and withhold it from America. I cannot believe this is our country, folks. I can't believe this is where we've descended. We'll be back in just a minute. When we come back, we're going to talk about Darrell Issa, the IRS investigation, and Elijah Cummings, who sits on the group on the committee panel, but has now been accused of actually colluding with the IRS to target certain conservative news or conservative organizations. I mean, give me a break, folks. This is just insane. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to America's Voice Now. This issue with the IRS is out of control. For the record, the Dallas IRS office, yesterday it was revealed, is plastered with pro-Obama stickers all over their computers. They have made statements to taxpayers that they would like to have seen President Obama reelected in 2012, even though they knew they had no right to say something like that in public. Today, there's a hearing related to Lois Lerner, and they're going to determine whether they're at this stage in the game, they're going to file for her to be found guilty of contempt of Congress. When that occurs, and they believe that it will, then they're going to request that the Department of Justice immediately begin a legal prosecution of her for criminal activity. The problem, of course, lies with the fact that the Department of Justice is run by none other than Eric Holder. But to make matters worse, turns out that it may well be that, and yesterday this was revealed, that an email from Representative Elijah Cummings and his staff was sent to and from the IRS, in which Cummings is actually involved in the investigation of these conservative groups. And it's possible that the IRS and Lois Lerner's office distributed to him information that's privileged and not privy even to a congressman. I mean, remember that, anyone's tax information is theoretically, allegedly protected. Now, the Internal Revenue sent tax documents to this targeted conservative group to Elijah Cummings' office, at his request, I might add. And here's where it gets worse, folks. He lied and told the panel that he'd never had any contact with the IRS related to this. You've got a senator who's actually lying to a committee he sits on. I mean, this is insane. Man, this is really, and of course, President Obama told Bill O'Reilly there's not even a smidgen of corruption to the IRS claim. Newly released emails show, despite previous denials by ranking oversight Democrat Elijah Cummings, that such a contact actually has occurred. Emails released by the GOP-led Oversight Committee show that Democratic staff requested information from the IRS tax-exempt division on True the Vote. This is the one, True the Vote, by the way, is the one that they were not only were they harassed by the IRS, but they were audited multiple times. They had visits from the ATF and all kinds of stuff. Republicans and conservative activists say the IRS tax-exempt division, led by former official Lois Lerner, targeted dozens of conservative groups because of their politics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Cummings became became interested in True the Vote and requested some information from True the Vote in October of 2012 on its volunteer activities and training. Well, first of all, why would a sitting congressman request that kind of information from... That's the IRS's job, if anyone's job at all. But interestingly enough, 5 days later, the IRS sent True the Vote a letter requesting that the group provide the agencies with copies of its volunteer registration forms, the additional information on its volunteer activities, and amazingly enough, ladies and gentlemen, the questions were all the same. Cummings staff requested more information from the IRS about True the Vote. This occurred in January of 2013, a year and a couple months ago. The request was sent on to the Legislative Affairs Office, and from there, 3 days later, Lois Lerner herself wrote to her deputy, Holly Paz, and she said, "Did we find anything?" And Paz wrote back that she hadn't heard back yet, and Lerner replied back, "Thanks, check tomorrow, please." In February of 2014, the Oversight Committee, in a hearing, Cummings denied allegations by True the Vote attorney Cleta Mitchell that his staff had worked with the IRS in targeting the group. In other words, True the Vote's attorney said in an open hearing, "Hey, that guy right there, Cummings, he's been cooperating and working with the IRS to target my client." Cummings said, "No way." Here's what Mitchell said. And again, Mitchell is the attorney for True the Vote. Quote, "We want to get to the bottom of how these coincidences happened, and we're going to try to figure out if there was any staff of this committee that might have been involved in putting True the Vote on the radar screen of some of these federal agencies. We don't know that, but we do know, or we're going to do everything we can do to try to get to the bottom of how all this happened." Cummings turned around and said, "What she just said is absolutely incorrect and not true." He staunchly argued back that he had nothing to do with it, that the Oversight Committee month-long investigation and the IRS whole scandal was a waste of time, and it was a waste of money, and it was a witch hunt. That was his argument back. Well, guess what? Yesterday, Darrell Issa, the chairman, and the five subcommittee chairmen sent a letter to Cummings on Thursday that they're demanding. Now, these are his fellow commissioners, right? That they're demanding an explanation for the activities of Cummings' staff. Here's what Issa said in the letter. "Although you have previously denied that your staff made inquiries to the IRS about conservation organization True the Vote that may have led to additional agency..." I'm sorry. Let me start that again. It's not conservation, it's conservative. "Although you have previously denied that your staff made inquiries to the IRS about conservative organization True the Vote that may have led to additional agency scrutiny, communications records between your staff and IRS officials, which you did not disclose to majority members or staff, indicates otherwise. As the committee is scheduled to consider a resolution holding Ms. Lerner a participant in responding to your communications that you failed to disclose to us in contempt of Congress, you have an obligation to fully explain your staff's undisclosed contacts with the IRS." Guess what? Cummings has no comment. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, has this become a banana republic? Is this what we can expect from our elected representatives? Partisanship on such a scale of corruption and intimidation and abuse, utilizing agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, like the EPA, like the IRS, as a weapon of mass destruction against the citizens of this country. This is insane. This is the kind of thing I would expect from some third world nation with a dictator who's living in splendor while his people are starving in the streets. I guess that's actually not too far off, is it? You see, it's not bad enough that the IRS is, and it's very bad, but it's not bad enough that the IRS is being used as a weapon. 3 times, Elijah Cummings himself sent letters to True the Vote, demanding the same information the IRS had requested. So clearly, they were colluding as to what questions to ask. And perhaps he figured, if they won't answer the IRS, I'll get the information. Folks, we have reached a point at which, for all intents and purposes, this government has ceased to be a nation that we can accept. A national government that we can accept. We can no longer accept it. You know, I found an article that was written by John Whitehead. I'm going to read it to you because it's worth it, and we got enough time for me to do this. John Whitehead is the president of the Rutherford Institute, which is a conservative organization. There's no denying And he's also the author of A Government of Wolves, the Emerging American Police State. Now, you've heard me talk about these same topics repeatedly, but I thought his letter was actually so appropriate that I wanted to give it the time for you to hear it here. Starts out, the State Department wants $400,000 to purchase a fiberglass sculpture of a camel looking at a needle for its new embassy in Pakistan. They've already spent their allotted $630,000 to increase the number of likes and the fans on their Facebook and Twitter pages. The NATO ambassador for the United States needs $700,000 for landscaping and gardening. The National Science Foundation would like $700,000 to put on a theatrical production about climate change. And the Senate staffers need $1.9 million for lifestyle coaching. Also, Yale University could really use $384,000 so that they can study the odd corkscrew shape of a duck's penis. These are actual line items paid for by American taxpayers, whose tax dollars continue to be wasted on extravagant, unnecessary items that serve no greater purpose than to fatten the wallets of corporations and feed political graft. Case in point, despite the fact that we have 46 million Americans living at or below the poverty line, 16 million children living in households without adequate access to food, and at least 900,000 veterans who rely on food stamps, enormous sums continue to be doled out for presidential vacations. 16 million for trips to Africa and Hawaii alone. Overtime fraud at the Department of Homeland Security, nearly $9 million in improper overtime claims. And that's just 6 of the DHS's many, many offices. In Hollywood movie productions, $10 million was spent by the Army National Guard on Superman movie tie-ins and advertising aimed at increasing awareness about the National Guard. $10 million. This doesn't even touch the astronomical amounts of money spent on dubious wars abroad. Consider that since 2001, Americans have spent $10.5 million every hour for numerous foreign military occupations, including Iraq and Afghanistan. Then there's the U.S. Supreme Court's recent decision in McCutcheon versus FEC, which reinforces a government mindset in which the rights of the wealthy are affirmed by the courts, while the rights of average working-class Americans are routinely dismissed as secondary to corporate and governmental concerns. Under the guise of protecting free speech, a divided 5-4 court did away with established limits on the number of candidates an individual can support with campaign contributions. In doing so, the justices expanded on the court's landmark 2010 ruling in Citizens United versus FEC, which not only gave unfettered free speech rights to corporations, but paved the way for corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money promoting candidates, especially presidential candidates. What this does, of course, is turn the ballot box into an auction block, wherein those who are elected to public office are bought and paid for by those who can afford to support their campaigns, namely lobbyists, corporations, and high-dollar donors. When all is said and done, what we are witnessing is the emergence of a disconcerting government mindset that interprets the Constitution one way for corporations, government entities, and the wealthy, and uses a second measure altogether for average Americans. Unfortunately, as I point out in my book, A Government of Wolves, the Emerging American Police State, this constitutional double standard is coming to bear in all aspects of our lives, not just in the realm of campaign finance law. It allows lobbyists intimate access to our elected officials, while prohibiting Americans from even standing silently in protest near a government building. It grants immunity to police officers who shoot unarmed citizens, while harshly punishing Americans who attempt to defend themselves, mistaking a SWAT team raid for a home invasion. And it gives government agents carte blanche access to Americans' communications and their activities, while allowing the government to operate in total secrecy with secret hearings, secret budgets, and secret agendas. This is a far cry from how a representative government is supposed to operate. Indeed, it has been a long time since we could claim to be the masters of our own lives. Rather, we are now the subjects of a militarized corporate empire in which the vast majority of the citizenry work their hands to the bone for the benefit of a privileged few. Adding injury to the ongoing insult of having our tax dollars misused and our so-called representatives bought and paid for by the moneyed elite, the government then turns around and uses the money we earn with our blood, sweat, and tears to target, imprison, and entrap us in the form of militarized police, surveillance cameras, private prisons, license plate readers, drones, and cell phone tracking technology. All those nefarious deeds that you read about in the paper every day, those are your tax dollars at work. It's your money that allows for government agents to spy on your emails, your phone calls, your text messages, and your movements. It's your money that allows out-of-control police officers to burst into innocent people's homes or probe and strip search motorists on the side of the road. And it's your money that leads to innocent Americans across the country being prosecuted for innocuous activities such as raising chickens at home, growing vegetable gardens, and trying to live off the grid. So what are you going to do about it? Excuse me. There was a time in our history when our forebears said, enough is enough, and stopped paying their taxes to what they considered an illegitimate government. They stood their ground and refused to support a system that was slowly choking out any attempt at self-governance, and which refused to be held accountable for its crimes against the people. Their resistance sowed the seeds for the revolution that would follow. Unfortunately, in the 200-plus years since we've established our own government, we've let bankers, turncoats, and number-crunching bureaucrats muddy the waters and pilfer the accounts to such an extent that we're back to where we started. Once again, we've got to decide whether we'll keep marching or break stride and make a turn toward freedom. If we don't have the right to decide what happens to our hard-earned dollars, then we don't have very many rights at all. If they can just take from you what they want, when they want, and then use it however they want, you can't claim to be anything more than a serf in a land they think of as theirs. This was the case in the colonial era, and it's the case once again. That was constitutional attorney John Whitehead. He's the founder and the president of the Rutherford Institute. And he's got that book out, A Government of Wolves, The Emerging American Police State. I've got to tell you, folks, I think he succinctly but accurately captured the essence and the spirit of where we are today. And I've said it many times. You've heard me say, the only way for us to end this is to begin to hold them accountable, to starve the beast. You have to realize that these folks cannot operate, these agencies can't operate. The unconstitutionality, the abuse, the tyranny, the terrorism, government-sponsored, state-sponsored terrorism directed against us, it cannot continue if what? If we stop paying them. Now, I recognize that that's not an easy thing to do. When you work for an employer, the employer, he pays the tax, right? on your behalf. You never actually see it. I get it. But it doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we can affect that we can't monkey wrench it. We can. For starters, you can go into your employer and refile the W-9 or the W-2 form so that immediately you're exempt from federal taxes. No money will be sent. Your paycheck will not have federal taxation taken out. Neither will your state. What are you supposed to do with that? Well, what I would suggest that you do with it is put it aside in a separate account. And hold on to it. Because at the end of the year, when you file your taxes, well, then of course you're going to have to come up with the money. But it does starve the government for the remainder of between now and next April. In fact, if you file an extension, you don't have to actually pay that money until sometime in October of the following year. We could have an 18-month window where we would, for all intents and purposes, freeze the cog, freeze the wheels, lock it down. We can sit here and watch as our property and our land and our government is stolen from us. Or we can take action to preserve that which we have and regain that which we have lost. You see, most people forget that we're seeing here an extended and long line of treasonous and unconstitutional, illegal, unethical, immoral behavior. Jefferson said to us that a single act of tyranny could be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day. But a series of oppressions, which have been begun at a distinguished period and pursued through every change of minister, too plainly proves a deliberate, systematic plan of reducing us to slavery. Think about that for a moment. It's one thing when you have an elected representative, even a president, who makes a mistake. They make a bad judgment call. They make a bad foreign policy call. They make a bad policy call with regard to something domestically. And a single act of tyranny, even when all the evidence was stood there and the person acted with impunity, knowing that, and all the empirical evidence surrounding that was an act that was of tyranny or even a mistake. And that can be ascribed to the accidental opinion of the day, his ideology. Maybe it was just But a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period, pursued unalterably through each and every change of ministers, plainly proves a deliberate, systematic plan of reducing us to slavery. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what have you seen? What have you experienced? What have we collectively experienced in the last 25, 30 years? This is not the accidental history version. This is a series of oppressions. Clear, empirical evidence is available to anyone that is willing to open their eyes and look. It was all begun at a distinguished period. It has been pursued through every change of minister. And it plainly proves a deliberate, systematic plan to reduce us to slavery. This is not a partisan issue of Republican or Democrat. This is a condemnation and a damnation of both of them. And that's all it is. You've been listening to America's Voice Now. Please visit us at americasvoicenow.org. You can find us at Facebook at facebook.com/America's Voice Now. And then you can find every program that we do at youtube.com/America's Voice Now. You all have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless. Keep the faith. Pray for those folks out there at the ranch, at the Bundy Ranch. We'll keep you appraised of what's happening there.